In 1979, author Octavia Butler published a novel which would become a foundational text in our understanding of slavery. Kindred tells the story of Dana, an African-American writer from California who travels back uncontrollably to early 1800s Maryland to protect her ancestors and ensure her own existence. In this episode, we are going to take a closer look at Kindred, both the book and its recent 2023 TV adaptation, as we answer the question, what does Kindred tell us about plantation life? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining us from the faculty is Dr. Rebecca Fraser, a historian of 19th century America with a particular interest in the history of African Americans, especially relating to their resistance against slavery and the enslaved experience. Welcome back, Rebecca.
Hello, thank you for having me again. And it's a pleasure to finally talk about a novel relating to slavery. I'm really excited about this particular episode.
Yeah, well, you inspired us to do this for this podcast because I remember covering it when you taught me about slavery. So, and it's always stuck in my mind. But also joining us today is Dr. Hilary Emmett, an associate professor in American Studies at the University of East Anglia. She researches the afterlives of enslavement in literature and visual culture, with a particular interest in the transnational reach of the late great Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison. Hello, Hilary.
Hello, Liam, and hi, Becky.
Hey.
It's great to have you both joining me for this discussion. Obviously, Kindred is a text that anyone who studies slavery is probably familiar with. Anyone who hasn't studied slavery has probably heard of, if not seen, the TV series. So let's just first wrap some context around this episode. I want to discuss the success of Kindred, both the book and the TV series, its reception, and the differences between the two in terms of how it portrayed Dana's story. Who wants to kick off? What were your thoughts?
I'll let the specialist in African American literature kick off, if that's all right, Hilary.
I was banking on Becky as the person with the podcast experience to kick off. So obviously I've been thinking a lot about this question since we kind of touted the idea of this podcast, and trying to think about this in two ways. Sort of once, I guess, first and foremost about what is successful about this adaptation. So in a way, what I liked about it, what I thought could have been differently, but also I guess to think about the process of adaptation itself and what we want adaptation to do. So I guess the thing, as Becky sort of said, you know, I think about literature, that is my field. So the thing I loved is that Dana wants to write for soaps, right? And when Kevin kind of takes her to task about that and says, well, you know, who even watches those? I don't even know what they are. She's like, yeah, women, you know, this is a medium that's kind of written for women. And it's clearly important to her to write the kinds of scripts that women want to see. So it got me thinking. I really felt that set up over the course of the whole adaptation, over the series. What does it mean to be a woman watching Kindred? And that very obviously, I could only speak from my own perspective as a white woman, a white Australian woman, with my own implication in histories of settler colonialism and unfree labour that went along with that. But yeah, what does it mean to be a woman from different subject positions watching this series? So one of the things that I looked out for quite carefully were these moments of implication, right? You know, how are white women being represented? And so I thought a lot about Margaret Whalen. I thought a lot about Penny, Kevin's sister, and of course the objectionable white neighbour. And I mean, we can kind of circle back to this, but I found myself sort of smugly thinking, oh, well, I'm nothing like Margaret Whalen, and I'm nothing like, you know, the terrible neighbour. But that character of Penny, I think, does interesting things to kind of, you know, to white women and white viewership. And that's not to center white women. Again, it's just to kind of ask what I feel like we're being asked by the the story, to think about our own implication, and women particularly, to think about what it is that we view and what is it that we want out of viewing. And I feel like I'm really focusing on the white characters here, and I don't mean to be doing that, and maybe we can come back and unpack that. But I guess what I then felt ambivalent about was the sympathy that I felt, these moments of sympathy that I think bubble up, that I felt the show was trying to make us feel for Margaret at times. And I felt, and I had to, I'm still kind of interrogating my own response to that. Is it that I felt sympathetic and now I feel sort of guilty and implicated that I felt sympathetic for her, or am I actually kind of cross with the show itself? That's maybe something to think about. And yeah, some of the representation of Kevin took a bit of getting used to, because I felt like that was actually one of the biggest departures from, I won't say the biggest, but one of the biggest departures from the book, was that Kevin, I think the Kevin of 2016 is very different to the Kevin of 1976, and that's something to talk about, in that, yeah, the kind of the book Kevin is more inclined to take that deep dive into history, and the show Kevin is sort of deeply oblivious. And I'm wondering if that's a difference between that 2016 context and the 1976 context, and something that Jacobs-Jenkins wants us to think about. But I feel like I've gone on enough, so I'm going to throw back to Becky.
Yeah, thanks, Hilary. It's sort of thinking about, sort of responsibility and implication. And I think the showrunner, or, sort of the creator of the show, Brandon Jacobs-Jenkins, kind of takes a risk here, right? It's not a complete replay of Octavia Butler's Kindred. He takes risks. And I think one of those risks, and I've read several interviews with him, and he's, a playwright. He's also a professor of African American history. And he was really eager not to sensationalize violence on the screen, which I think he did brilliantly. I mean, it really was well achieved there. And much of it was left to our imagination as viewers, but we still got the experience of Dana. We still got, sort of the utter kind of dislocation of her, what was happening, right? But also I agree with Hilary that, sort of Kevin didn't have long enough to, sort of develop into a fully formed character, I didn't feel. And because the season ends and there's no more yet, he may go on a journey himself, and we see him right at the end. So this is a bit of a spoiler here. Kevin, it ends. So Kevin is left in the past, in sort of early Maryland, plantation, on the Wayland plantation, without Dana. So Dana's gone home. She's been transported back to California without Kevin. And we see Kevin astride a horse, I think, acting in a very kind of authoritative way. We're not really sure whether he's an overseer or an enslaver himself, whether he's bought an enslaved person. But I think he's doing this to protect possibly Alice, who is, sort of the enslaved woman that will subsequently mother Hagar, who is Dana's great grandmother. But I also think I want to add, and maybe want to talk about a little bit more as the show progresses, Barry Jacobs-Jenkins suggested in several of the interviews that actually the point he was trying to make was about, sort of, we're all related to enslaved peoples, right? So the fact that, sort of this history is your history, it's my history, it's because of the sexual exploitation that took place, the gratuitous rape of enslaved women, that birthed biracial children, so enslaved mothers and white fathers, usually the enslaver or an enslaver's family member, a male family member. And so, and I think, so that was the point. I thought, right, okay, so, it's about, sort of descendancy and the kind of the links and the heritage there. So, sort of, I think, he takes risks. And certainly I was not impressed with the fact that Dana and Kevin take an iPod with them. on their journeys, and it never runs out of power. I'm just, sort of, they spend months in this place. So there are a kind of poetic license, but I do think he took risks, and I do think he did it genuinely well. I'm quite sad that there's not another series yet.
I wonder if the iPod thing is supposed to be a nod to the fact that it's still running on 2016 time, and therefore, because only a few hours have passed, maybe that's why it never ran out of charge.
Possibly.
But I actually couldn't get past the first episode of the TV show, and I tried. I honestly tried, but I just narratively it lost me. I was too invested in the book. I loved the book too much, and you're right. He took a risk with the adaptation, and that's probably going to speak to a lot of people. But it lost me. I'm not too sure why they had to set it in 2016 versus 1976. There's a lot of things.
I mean, Jacob Jenkins' explanation there, and this was most interesting when I read the interviews, was that it was the kind of this moment. So Obama had done 2 terms, right? It was this supposedly post-racial America, and it was the last moment, really. We could really believe, possibly. I didn't believe it was post-racial in America, but some people could believe that it was post-racial America, right? So 2016 is a really significant date, yeah, or year, where things began to shift quite dramatically after this date. And why some viewers may feel uncomfortable with that if they've read the book.
I mean, it comes back to what we think adaptation is, right? So just to speak to Becky's point there about 2016, I mean, it's a moment of complacency, right? And if you think about, so one of the reasons that Octavia Butler gave for writing the book in the first place is that she felt there was a misunderstanding of the African-American past, right? Of the past of enslavement. And she wrote it in response to someone that she'd overheard basically saying that, that he'd felt there wasn't enough resistance, right? That people, that his parents and ancestors hadn't pushed back hard enough. And she wanted to redress that kind of ignorance. And I think complacency isn't quite the same thing as what Butler saw as a kind of ignorance, willful or otherwise. But I feel like, again, Jacob Jenkins is taking up that moment and saying, okay, this is a critical moment, and that historical fiction is always as much about the present as it is about the past that it's fictionalizing. So just to really endorse Becky's point there, that I think that 2016 is such a key moment, and I think we can move from there outwards to say, what does adaptation do? Is it supposed to be faithful? Is it supposed to be a critical reading of the source material? And if so, what critical reading is Jacob Jenkins offering for us here? And taking a cue from the adaptation that he's done that I'm most familiar with, apart from this, is his adaptation of The Octoroon, which was a 19th century play by Dion Bouciot. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which he adapted as an octoroon and nested kind of a series of plays within plays in that. And what becomes very clear in that adaptation, and I don't want to spoil it for people who might get to see it on stage because it's phenomenal, it's incredibly confronting, is that there is a moment in which the audience, and very particularly the white audience, is shown to be implicated in the terrible history that they're watching, that they've been laughing at the melodrama, they've been thoroughly enjoying this deeply racist 19th century drama on stage. So again, I think that kind of brings us back to, in what ways is this 2016 world implicated in the past? To what extent did that moment really signify that we are still living with that unfinished business?
Okay, fine. You've sold me on that. I will accept that. I'd like to pick up on something that you mentioned, Becky, which is the fact that the TV series deliberately strayed away from the violence, from the sort of the gory on-screen details. And I think that's quite a bold choice, because the book, I think, is quite direct in its depiction of the violence, particularly of when Dana was being whipped by Tom Whaling. That was described in quite uncomfortable detail. And other recent films, like 12 Years a Slave, for instance, as a classic example, that was very head on. So let's talk about Kindred in terms of how it is actually representing plantation life here. Both the book and the TV series, what is it shying away from? Should it have been more violent in the TV series? Would that have been a more accurate depiction?
Well, it's difficult because it's quite sensationalized, isn't it? Violence, particularly around sort of films and TV in relation to slavery. And I think 12 Years a Slave, actually, Steve McQueen got a little bit of sort of flack for that. I mean, I was weeping in the cinema, right? But then the Underground Railroad, the TV adaptation of the Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead was, I mean, like that. I binge watched it for a piece I was writing in the conversation, and oh my goodness, that was brutal. I mean, absolutely brutal. Sort of scenes of sort of enslaved men being roasted over fires, and it was but there was a purpose for that. And then other episodes were very quiet. I mean, very, very quiet. And I think we need to understand that actually enslaved experiences and enslaved lives were complex, right? There's no one story fits all. I was thinking about Maryland as a plantation society, and to be honest, if anybody's going to know Maryland, it's through Baltimore, right? Rather than sort of the various counties and such like. The history of Maryland is interesting in the sense that it was tobacco farming, much like Virginia, during slavery, and then of course that kind of farming exhausts the soil, right? So there were very few like palatial slaveholding mansions in places like Maryland, and the idea of this whole kind of gone with the wind, massive plantation houses, and sort of a whole kind of horde of enslaved peoples that are working the land is, by 1860, I was doing some research earlier, and which is just before the start of the Civil War, non-slaveholders accounted for 76.1% of the population in the United States, right? 1 to 9 enslaved peoples were owned by 17.2%. So 1 to 9 is the majority of, enslaved peoples that many people had, like the most people had. So that is not to say, however, that sort of slavery wasn't a massive, expansive business. And the most important thing I think we have to remember is Maryland was an exporting slave state. It basically, once the transatlantic slave trade across the Atlantic to Africa was made illegal in 1808, there developed on the North American mainland something known as the domestic slave trade, or the interregional trade. And there were certain slave states in the upper South, so places like Maryland, who sold in massive numbers enslaved peoples to the sort of Southwest, to sort of places like Mississippi and Louisiana, and even sort of South Carolina to a certain extent. So I think we can think about famous enslaved peoples that came from Maryland. So Harriet Tubman, for instance, who escaped slavery, and was also a film made about her. Frederick Douglass, we were talking about Douglass a couple of weeks ago. So both Douglass and Tubman have very, very different experiences of slavery, and Tubman chooses to escape from the plantation after it's revealed that she's next on the list to be sold, right? So I think sort of there's nothing wrong with portraying Maryland and the Whaling plantation as a working plantation, as quite a sort of huge plantation. There were plantations in Maryland that were quite sizable, but I think there's a kind of image or mythology around southern antebellum slavery whereby sort of it was all these like massive mansion houses with acres and acres and acres of arable land and such like. And this just really wasn't the case. These were mostly small farmers who hired enslaved peoples in addition to the 2 or 3 or 4 that they owned. So there is a kind of a little bit of a disconnect, I think, between how we remember slavery and what we're fed into the public imagination, and actually, you know, sort of what the reality was.
I wonder though, you know, obviously Kindred is a work of fiction, so there is an element of dramatization there. There has to be an element of sensationalism to hook the reader or the viewer. And we also have to remember that Kindred is a first person narrative. It's Dana's story. So, you know, thinking about that, about the narratively, and as you know, as a text, Hilary, I wonder if you could speak on sort of Kindred as a piece of work that's not necessarily depicting the truth so much as depicting a truth.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really key point, in part because I think in my reading of Butler, and again, I think in our reading of this television program as well, we can be guided by the wonderful Toni Morrison. And something that she said when asked about the writing of Beloved, and I don't know, I'm sure, Becky, your eagle eye picked this up, but the book that Kevin gets from his sister's study when he goes in to get the gun and he pretends he's getting a book for Dana is Beloved. And again, I'm still kind of unpacking that in my mind. Is it because that would give him kind of plausible deniability, right? You know, like, oh, it's such an important book, you know, but also kind of, dude, what makes you think that, you know, this very, you know, confident, compelling young woman that you've just met hasn't bloody already read Beloved, right? You know, so I thought that was a really interesting moment. But I think that, again, that's Jacobs Jenkins is signaling to us to not forget that Kindred is part of this tradition of African American women writing about enslavement. Beloved is very much about the past keeping hold of the present, right? You know, so, and that Setha's whole life is spent keeping the past at bay, right? Trying to beat back that past that threatens to overwhelm her present. And I could talk about Beloved, as I think you both know, for about 4 hours. But I think what to pick up here is that Morrison, when asked about that novel, explained that she doesn't, as a novelist, she doesn't think about the difference between fact and fiction, but she thinks about the relationship between fiction and truth. And she says that fact is opposed to fiction, but truth is not. And she considers it her single gravest responsibility not to lie. So I guess one of the things I've been thinking about is, what truth did Butler see herself as exploring through this fiction? And again, what truth, I mean, I really deeply believe that Jacobs Jenkins is, you know, is super informed by Morrison and her thinking and writing around this. What truth did he want to elicit in his rendering of Butler's novel? And one thing I've been wondering about, because I very much take Becky's point that this plantation isn't necessarily an accurate representation of what most life was like for the enslaved and enslavers alike. But I also found myself asking throughout the series, we never know what this plantation produces, right? Like the Tom Whalen character, like, he's very pleased with himself for having blackmailed his former brother-in-law, or the husband of his former sister-in-law, into giving up his land, and he's like, oh, and my yield is now twofold, or whatever it is he says. But we don't know what it is, right? And we don't see a lot of that actual labor. So I did wonder if this is sort of deliberately being presented as the kind of every plantation, right? And that we're not being given this kind of rich historical texture, I think, that Butler gave us, that was so important for Butler, precisely because we, like Dana and Kevin, are being pulled into that world, and there needed to be enough perhaps left unsaid for us to project, I don't know, ourselves into it. So that was kind of, that's one of the ways I've been trying to think through this strangely inaccurate and yet deeply, again, sort of detailed representation of plantation life, I guess.
But I also think, as a historian of African-American experiences, and particularly slavery, that historians are so confined by the archive, right? we can't make up what's not there, right? So, sort of, and even if Stephanie Camp, in her brilliant Closer to Freedom, suggests that we might employ the historical imagination. So, sort of take what is there in the sources, whether it's in shards or, linear feet, and then, employ what else we know about slavery and the conditions of particular individuals enslaved in that system. But she's not making it up. So there are limits. Marissa Fuentes, her brilliant work, suggests kind of reading with the grain. Yeah, so thinking about, sort of what's there and what can we make of it, particularly around, sort of enslaved experiences for women in Barbados. But we cannot make up history, right? As historians, I mean, as respectable historians. So, and I think that's the wonder of books like Octavia Butler's Kindred and Toni Morrison's Beloved, that actually it begins to put that kind of, sort of moving from historical imagination to the kind of, sort of subjectivity that actually we can never know what enslaved women's experiences were like. That Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler begin to think of these things in much, they're given kind of poetic license, but also they also give us that kind of subjective element that historians cannot do, right? So I do think, sort of, it's so much, I mean, we work in American studies, right? So I'm at liberty to use novels on my module and think about, sort of the importance of, what this suggests. But as historians, and I am a historian, we can't get to that subjective experience in the way that Black female novelists, writing particularly from sort of the 70s, can and do.
It's interesting.
Would you agree, Hilary?
Yeah, I don't want to cut Liam off there, but yeah, absolutely. And again, this is something that Morrison herself speaks about in terms of what she found in the archive and what she sought to kind of flesh out in the archive. And we'll say, it's a shame we had hoped to have one of our recently graduated postgraduate research students with us, who's just written a wonderful thesis in which she talks about the importance of aesthetic identity. And I think there's been a lot of literary critical work around interiority and recuperating and reimagining the interior life of the enslaved, and in particular through writers like Butler and Morrison, Gail Jones and others, a recreation of the interior life of enslaved women. But Poppy argues that actually it's more than that. It allows us to flesh out and kind of return that subjectivity to a visible body, right? A visible body that we can imagine, and a face and features. And that is, that's very much something that fiction can do. And cinema, television, potentially more so, though in a way it's less intimate because we're not imagining that for ourselves. We're being presented with the director and casting directors take on what Dana should look like. Though I have to say, I think she's absolutely brilliant. The actress is apparently just out of drama school and just does an extraordinary job of portraying Dana. So.
It's interesting this because in a previous episode I was talking to John Mitchell about Forrest Gump, and we were talking specifically about the historical accuracy of it and where that line is, in terms of how much can you fictionalize for the sake of inciting discussion and interest in certain things. And we sort of looked at things like Inglourious Bastards as well, which sort of takes that line way out there and sort of blows Hitler up in the theatre, which obviously didn't happen. I feel like it's maybe a little bit different when we're tackling subjects as sensitive as slavery. There has to maybe be a little bit more, things have to be a bit more rooted in historical accuracy, I think. But I kind of see why there's a certain poetic license, as you said, with Kindred. And one of the themes that I really got from Kindred was this idea of inevitability. And I think that's, and of connectedness, as you mentioned earlier, this idea that we're all connected to slavery, we're all related to it in one way or another. And I think that's why there was a focus on the sexual abuse that happened on the plantation, particularly of Alice. But for me, it was all about this sense that, because ultimately it's a time travel story, there's this sense that Dana had to protect what was going on then in order for the present to be as it is now. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, that actually is quite an uncomfortable way of looking at it. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that were.
Well, it's the whole you can't shoot your granddad type thing, right?
Mm.
If you go back in time, yeah. So Hagar had to be born, right? Because otherwise Dana wouldn't be born, right? So she had to produce generations. And I think that's as it's just wonderful of Butler to women, enslaved women, and sort of future descendants of women. They carry secrets. They may not have told their children that they were, sort of created through an act of violence. And subsequently, the children's children may not know anything. So, sort of these enslaved women and some of their descendants, they carry secrets. And I think for me, that's what is so important about Butler's text. The female centric element, which Hilary has already talked about, but also, sort of what does it mean to be an enslaved woman and then, a descendant of an enslaved woman. So yeah, I think that's the real kind of moment for me around, sort of this element of having to protect the past to ensure a future.
Which I think is given a really, really an interesting extra turn of the screw in the adaptation, right? And this is something, again, I feel like everything I've said is I'm still grappling with this. And it's in part because I was kind of expecting there to be a second season, and really hoping it's going to get picked up by another network, because I feel as though Jacobs Jenkins set up so many complicated and already complicated story, right, in order to kind of set up so many threads that are nowhere near resolved. But the story of Winnie, right, in the adaptation, where Dana, if I'm reading it correctly, Dana's wrong, right? Like for the most part of this series, she thinks it's Carrie who is her ancestor. So everything she does is set up to protect Carrie.
That's an interesting.
Oh yeah, no,
little
Liam,
twist.
I think you should give it another
That's
shot,
right.
because
Yeah.
because it is different, but I think it's trying to do more with this question of implication, right? And this is why I keep coming back to who is implicated, right? Like who is being taken to task by this adaptation. So Dana sets events in motion because she thinks she needs to protect Carrie, to stop Carrie being sold away from the plantation. And so she incites Winnie, who has been taken as a as a sexual plaything by Tom Whalen, and by inciting her to run away, right? And Winnie's really ambivalent about this. And again, this is one of these really key moments of, of not thinking that in the present we have any sense of what it meant to be an enslaved woman. And it's not really not quite the same thing at all, but there's shades of Harriet Jacobs in the character of Winnie, right? Which is that there are moments where she indicates that she would prefer to stay with Tom Whalen as a devil she knows than take her chances out in the world where dogs will be sent after her, where who knows where she'll end up. And she's even kept in a crawl space, for a couple of days rather than for the years that Harriet Jacobs spent in her grandmother's attic. But I think there's sort of a callback there to Jacobs and that question of, to what extent can an enslaved woman choose her own sexual partner, exploitative as that it inevitably is. But anyway, so Dana sets in motion these events where Winnie takes matters in her own hands and attempts to escape to freedom. But that's what takes Kevin out of Dana's kind of arm's reach, right? And sets in motion this train of events where Kevin gets left in antebellum Maryland, and Dana comes back to present day LA. And I don't think that's a spoiler because obviously it happens in the book, but it's framed very, very differently. And
just to
Kevin's
clarify
kind of,
for anyone listening, that the idea of Kindred is that if you're touching in physical contact with Dana when she transports, you go with her. So that's how Kevin ended up in the 1800s.
Yeah. So and there's this again, which is again I believe to be a change from the novel. I actually didn't get to reread it quite as in depthly as I intended to before this podcast, but there's a moment in the series where Kevin has basically said, I don't want to come back with you. I don't want to go there. And that in itself is, we need to think that through. Is that okay? Can he just do that because he's got the privilege of being the white guy who's not deeply connected to this past? He basically says, look, I don't want to go back with you. But when Dana starts to be pulled back, it's so traumatic and so violent, and her movements are kind of so involuntary that she actually hangs on to him. And it's not quite clear whether she's just overriding his refusal to come or whether she really can't let go. And she certainly apologizes to him and kind of says, look, I just, I couldn't let go. But there's a way in which Dana has compelled Kevin to do something against his will, to be kind of drawn back into this time.
I also think, so we're back to adaptation again, aren't we? Because Jacobs Jenkins assumed that he would have, sort of several seasons to play out, sort of these characters' stories, right? So and so who knows, sort of how Winnie's life will fold out, or sort of how Kevin's story will develop. So sort of I think the beauty of adaptation, particularly for TV series, is that you can get a lot more, sort of you can tell a lot more story, whereas sort of the book's the book, right? And I don't know how many pages. I reread it over the weekend, and sort of it has to sort of serve a particular function in 300 pages, and that's it. The beauty of an adaptation done really well is that stories can unfold gradually, and we may know by sort of season 3 whether Dana intended to sort of take Kevin back or not.
I have a theory that the big twist that Jacob Jenkins is going to introduce is that Kevin's actually the father of Dana, because when we see him at the end, he's with Alice, right? Like he's on a horse, kind of acting as an enslaver, and it's not clear whether that's a role that he's playing to protect Alice or whether it's a role that he's lent into. I mean, enough has been changed, I think, from the book that we can't really trust that that Kevin is going to kind of end up being the guy that he is in the novels. So anyway, I have allowed myself to speculate. I wonder if we'll get this kind of radical twist where Kevin somehow, that given that Dana was wrong about Carrie, is she also going to be wrong about Alice? Though I suppose it's in the family Bible that Alice and Rufus have a child, but who knows? Anyway, that's my theory, my spoiler theory, that Kevin's going to be even more implicated than we think. So, and that there's a reason that he needed to be pulled back in that same kind of, you can't shoot your grandfather, but everyone needs to be in their right places in the past for the present to play out. So why does Kevin need to be there? Because he's going to play a key role.
You're not feeling that. You're not feeling that, Becky.
No, because I do think that sort of thinking about the trauma of white people, actually, and it's a subject that's not really discussed a lot quite reasonably, really. But thinking about the socialization of white enslaved children into slavery and authority and mastery, if you're a boy in particular, and the way in which Rufus's story, you see Rufus go from sort of quite a polite, sort of sometimes a bit tetchy, especially with his mother, but with Dana, he's sort of really, really lovely. And then we see him develop. And this is what slavery does, right? To impose his ideas around mastery and authority. And they model behavior, right? So he sees his father acting a particular way with the enslaved who laboured on the plantation, but also with other white men. And he takes that he learns that that's the way to be a white man in the South if you have a certain level of money. And so, so I think white trauma, particularly in terms of children being socialised into white children being socialised into slavery and slave mastery, is another element that I think Butler just did wonderfully well with, actually.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. But what if for Jacobs Jenkins, it's easy for Kevin to slip into that role, right? That he's
Can I
making the
imagine,
point
though, Kevin sleeping with Alice?
that are not yet necessarily, but we don't know. I thought that was really interestingly
We'll never
set up
know
at
if
the
the
end
second
of the.
season
I know,
doesn't arrive.
but I guess what I'm asking is, given that the Kevin of this adaptation is very different to the Kevin of the book, and I think we can, I think that's just sort of a very sort of a clear and fair statement to make. I wonder if Jacobs Jenkins' point is that this white dude of 2016 is actually not that far off, is fewer degrees of separation, or fewer generations away from the enslaver than he would like to think. And I think some of the clues to that are things like he's embraced African American popular culture. He kind of falls on her her records, her vinyl collection. He sort of enjoys showing off his knowledge of African American music. And there's a moment where the sister is unsurprised to see Kevin with Dana as a black woman. And I thought, oh, are we going to get some comment that Kevin actually, has regularly gone out with black women? And I don't know. I just wonder if actually we're being presented with a situation where there's not as much distance between Kevin and a Waylon as
Rufus
as we think.
in the book, where he can't really tell Alice and Dana apart by the end, right? That actually, maybe as the story unfolds in season 2 and 3, that sort of Kevin can't really tell Alice and Dana apart. And it would be absolutely sort of enthralling to think about that in terms of white implication, and moving away from that kind of white savior narrative, which actually Butler never ever inserts into her text. The traumatization of Rufus is done so sort of brilliantly. But sort of, if Kevin was to sort of become like Rufus and not really be able to tell the difference between Alice and Dana, that would be really interesting, I think.
So as a white man, I'm very conscious here of not wanting to be victimizing 19th century white men, but there is a commentary here, isn't there, about how everyone can be corrupted by their environment. In the book, it was definitely Rufus. There was references there to how he was almost treated as poorly as the slaves at time by Tom Whalen, and he grows up to be a slaveholder because that's his place in society. That's what he's told he should do. So it's very interesting how that sort of played out in the TV series there with Kevin. I think Kevin obviously got a lot more time in the series than he did in the book, I think, for his character to develop. But I think we need to look at rounding off this discussion for now, even though we could go on for hours. And if there's anyone that's been listening to this because they're very interested in conversations around slavery, but they don't know what the heck goes on in Kindred, I'd like just both of you to offer some words of wisdom as to why anyone should read or watch Kindred.
Well, it was the first ever, I think, science fiction book by a black woman. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hilary. But I think for the poignancy and the kind of the beauty of how Butler focuses on the past, but brings it to the present as well. So she's really saying, right, so you can't ignore your past, you can't erase sort of the stain of slavery on the American nation. And this is what Frederick Douglass was saying sort of over 100 years before, sort of America is a shameful nation for enacting slavery upon black people. So, sort of, I think it is just one of the most complex and interesting fictional texts around black women's experiences, both in the present, in 20 sort of in 19 when was it 1970,
published in 79,
yeah,
and set in 1976.
sorry, and I was thinking about the adaptation 2016, and sort of, but reflecting back to slavery in Maryland, early Maryland, early 19th century.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think to echo what Becky said there, that Kindred is just an extraordinary novel. It was innovative for its time and still is. It's an absolutely foundational work of Afrofuturism. But I think, even beyond that, again, it's just a kind of a compelling rendering of how we are still living with the unfinished business of the 19th century. Right? And it's a beautiful portrait of 1976, as well as a portrait of 1815, 1816, in the same way that Jacobs Jenkins I think is doing something interesting with 2016, and I think we didn't quite get to see him take flight with that in the first season that we've got, but you can see where he was starting to go with the discussions about whether or not you call the police, right, to a scene of domestic disturbance. And I think he's texturing that, because that the neighbor couple are they are unbearable, right? They're unspeakable, terrible people. And yet it does sound as though a young black woman is being violently assaulted in her home by a kind of schlubby white guy. So in that way, they're not entirely wrong in their, hey, we heard screaming, what's going on here? And so there's an element of satire, I think, in that representation. But also, I think Jacobs Jenkins doesn't give us easy answers. He doesn't give us kind of easy caricatures of people. So I think both reading and viewing Kindred turns a lens on us. And I see that as a key feature of the way Jacobs Jenkins works with adaptation. And so it's like they're worth reading for their version of Antebellum Maryland and enslavement, but also their rendering of race relations in the 70s, the complexities of an interracial relationship in the 70s, but also what that looks like, what that looks like now.
This episode of America, a history podcast, was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A huge thanks to our guests this week, Dr. Rebecca Fraser and Dr. Hilary Emmett, for joining me on this show. And if you like the discussion and you want to learn more, you can check out some of the resources in the show notes. And of course, a lot of work goes into this podcast, so if you can leave us a review and a rating wherever you're listening, that would be amazing. Next time, we take a look at one of the most successful television shows of all time. In honour of the late Matthew Perry, we ask, could Friends be any bigger?